Pack 'em dead.
I hope you're safe and well wherever you are, and I would like to welcome you to a special Economic Science Association session on preferences, norm, and behavioral change in the coronavirus epidemic. Our first speaker is Benjamin Ho. While he's loading his slides, just know that you can put your questions in Q&A, and we will respond through chat. We will go straight to discussants after the presentation.
Good. That looks great.
All right, thank you very much. And also apologies if there's any noise. They just started doing construction outside a window today, so hopefully that won't be too annoying. And of course, homeschooling is going on outside. Anyways, here's our paper, Fear and Favoritism in the Time of COVID-19. We were very much inspired during the height of the pandemic, early on especially. There were a lot of reports of increased racism. There was a lot of use by, say, conservative media of the term, say, the China virus to sort of otherize the Chinese. There was a lot of fear about immigrants and refugees. And so we were interested in the impact of how does fear exacerbate that, or does it mitigate that? And in particular, this is a big literature, and so we're interested in how, what channels does it operate through, what's the impact of conservative media, and what's the impact of economic preferences. So that's the overview of our experiment. I always try to start a paper with a philosopher, like I've had like Plato and Confucius, but this is my favorite philosopher for this talk. This is Yoda. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering, right? So that's our question. Does fear lead to hate, or is it the opposite, right? Because there's this other idea that fear of the other can bring us together. Right, during wartime, different factions tend to come together, and that's all well supported in the literature. But what's not well supported is when one effect dominates over the other. All right, so that's what we're going to do. So like I said, the motivation was just these increasing reports of things like the China virus and increasing reports of racism. And we're interested in the culpability of the media in this, right? So, I think we all saw this story about how 91% of news stories in the US about COVID-19 were negative, even when things were getting better. So does the media exacerbate these trends, or is there good news out there, right? I don't know if you saw these videos out there about some good news during the COVID pandemic. This helped me a lot, and so I think we're going to have actually some good news coming out of our paper here today. So here's the overview of the paper. Our main finding is that reported fear is correlated with outgroup antagonism. Right, that the people that say they're more fearful are actually also, they treat the outgroup less, less pro-socially. But induced fear, the fear induced by our experiment, sort of causes more outgroup altruism. So it's sort of this this fear bringing us together effect seems to be more important. All right, so the experimental design is, the treatment is write an autobiographical emotional memory task paragraph about fear. I'll give you more details about that in a little bit. The outcome is, you want to donate your subject payment to the in-group, which is going to be the Korean Red Cross. Our context here is going to be South Korea, or to Outgroup, which is a foreign worker charity helping people affected by COVID-19. All right, and the mechanism we're interested in is social preferences and the media. The subject pool of our experiment is 6,000 nationally representative samples of South Koreans, balanced by age, province, gender. As I said, the main findings of the reported fear is positive, and antagonism is positively correlated, but induced fear is negatively correlated. All right, so that's the gist. The three mechanisms, therefore, we're interested in is, there's a lot of literature that says fear increases favoritism, right? That we circle the wagons when we're afraid, that conflict tends to increase, in-group fairness in games. There's a ton of studies about that. Psychology talks about something called terror management theory, about how reminders of our mortality increases our in-group support. All right, these reminders are write a paragraph about your mortality, or they do an experiment by a graveyard, right? And they find all these cases, increases in-group favoritism, increases out-group derogation, increases support for Bush in the 2004 paper, increases support for Trump in 2017, right? So those are reasons to think that fear increases favoritism toward your in-group. On the other hand, there's a ton of papers about the common enemy effect. right? About how fear reduces favoritism, that conflict causes cooperation generally, but it's not clear is it the in-group only, at least according to this recent survey in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, right? I think we don't have a good answer as to which, which of these effects dominate. And an important caveat to all this is that selection is going to be really important, right? There's an emerging literature that fearful people also tend to be more favoritistic. I think one of the neatest studies in this is that conservatives are more sensitive to noise and threatening images, right? That like just the pure sensitivity of conservatives, they tend to like sort of, frighten more from noise, from loud noises. Conservative amygdalas are also bigger and more responsive to fear. And so if conservative values are correlated with more in-group favoritism, then we're going to have a selection effect that we worry about, right? And we sort of know from Haidt's work and more recently by Benjamin Enke and the JPE that conservatives do respond more to in-group focused political messages. All right, so this is the overall design of the experiment. We're going to begin with some background questions, some Gallup questions and some measures of risk and patience. Then there's our main treatment. Our main treatment is this emotional memory task treatment. We also have a media treatment that didn't produce any results, so I won't talk about that as much here, but I will, I'll show you briefly. And then our outcome variable is donations to a charity, either, for COVID relief, either to the Korean Red Cross or for foreign workers. We also have a bunch of other outcome variables we're interested in. One is you click through for more information about a fundraiser for multi-ethnic families, and also a bunch of policy opinions about different demographic groups in South Korea. All right, and the main mechanisms we're going to be interested in are the kinds of media people consume and the kinds of social preferences that they report. So here is the main treatment. On the left, our basic treatment is fear. We're interested in how people feel. We're interested in how and when people feel fear or anxiety. Such feelings may be due to a variety of reasons. And so we ask people to sort of write about things about fear. All right, that is the treatment group. The control group in this case is happiness, right? We thought a lot about should the control group be a more neutral control, like just just talk about what you did yesterday. But we're worried that in the time of COVID, everyone's gonna be afraid, right? And that a more neutral control where you just sort of talk about what you did yesterday, people are still gonna be thinking about fear. So we thought about, okay, we need something else. We thought about using hope, but hope is not well validated. Happiness is very well validated for this task, so we use happiness as our control group in this experiment. All right, we crossed the fear versus happy treatment with a media treatment about different media reports. That did not work at all. So there are no significant differences there, so we won't talk about them here today. Here is the main empirical specification. There's basically three main specifications that we're interested in. One is just what is the treatment effect on our outcome variables. The second is just what is the pure reported fear effect on our outcome variables. And the third is an IV of the fear effect on the outcome variables using the treatment as an IV. All right, and again, the main outcome variables are in-group donations, out-group donations, and fundraiser click-through. So here's the first stage of our results, right? This is the impact of fear of our treatment on fear and other emotions, and good, it works, right? That basically, doing our fear treatment increases fear on a Likert scale. It also increases sadness and surprise, by a lesser extent, which is actually consistent with the literature, right? This is a very common inducement in the literature, and so we sort of expected that. But the main effect is that our treatment did cause an increase in fear. And so our results is, these are our main results, all right? So the fear treatment did cause an increase in outgroup donations. There was no effect in any of our treatments on in-group donations. The effect was entirely on outgroup donations. And so the treatment increased outgroup donations by 9%. However, we see that reported fear is associated with 6 to 9% less outgroup donations, right? So the treatment increased donations, but reported fear, right, the observed fear coming into the experiment was associated with fewer donations. We find that adding in controls can take away about a quarter of the effect. We'll sort of analyze this more carefully in the mediation analysis coming through, but I'll come back to that later. And then that the IV estimate says that a 1-point increase of fear on this 4-point Likert scale, increases donations by 80 to 90%. All right, that's our main effect. We found very similar results for our secondary outcome variable, which is, did you seek fundraiser information for this multi-ethnic family fundraiser, even though the reported fear effects were not significant. We also looked at survey measures, which I'll come back to in the discussion. We asked, we looked at questions from the Korean General Social Survey. Do you want the following groups to decrease in Korea? You don't have to follow these numbers. The point just is that we see the exact same patterns for foreign professional workers and Korean Chinese, right? Korean Chinese, if you don't know, is also sort of a, commonly derogated ethnic group in South Korea. They just sort of hold sort of low status jobs. And so these groups are, so we saw that the fear treatment caused less antagonism for these outgroups, even though reported fear was correlated with more antagonism for these outgroups. These are other questions we took from the World Value Survey. Groups you would not like to have as neighbors. So we saw the same patterns for foreign immigrants, former convicts, and refugees. The others were largely insignificant. Again, the fear treatment reduces the antagonism toward the outgroups, but reported fear was positively correlated with antagonism. All right, so then we sort of turned to looking at mechanisms. Right, so the first thing we looked at for mechanism was looking at heterogeneity. For example, is the effect bigger if conservative media is high versus is the effect bigger if conservative media viewership is low? So in terms of like just pure heterogeneity with respect to political ideology, we found that conservative ideology is associated with outgroup antagonism and makes the effect of reported fear insignificant. Right, interaction effects with conservative ideology on the part of the participant had no effect, was not significant. But this is consistent with the idea that reported fear is basically a proxy for conservative ideology. Recall the literature about selection and how conservatism is correlated with fearfulness. We also, in terms of the media effects, we found that basically people who read conservative newspapers had a larger relationship between reported fear and outgroup antagonism. The basic idea is that the effect of fear is amplified by reported media consumption. All right, of course, these are associations. We were hoping to show this through our media treatment, but basically our media treatment did not cause any changes in behavior. The second channel of mechanism that we looked at was the impact of fear on social preferences, right? So we saw that fear increases favoritism, or fear decreases favoritism. We want to see what is the channel for that, right? Does it impact through trust, through altruism, through reciprocity? And so we measured all those things using the Falk et al. Global Preference Survey. And we found that, so in the first stage of the mediation analysis, right, that our fear treatment does increase altruism, and does increase trust, but has no particular impact on reciprocity. All right, and so in the full mediation analysis, we basically find that the only thing that's only significant effect, only significantly mediating effect of fear is through the increase in altruism. Right, the fear seems to increase altruism, and that increase in altruism accounts for about 16% of the total effect of fear on our outcome variables. All right, so this is using a generalized mediation estimate, but the basic idea is you first run the regression of our treatment of our fear treatment on the outcome variables, and then you sort of add in controls for altruism, and you find that the altruism effect accounts for about 0.23 of the main effect, or 16%. All right, so here is a little bit of external validity. Of course, we have all this is done in the context of a very narrow experiment. And apologies to the discussant, these results are all brand new, so they weren't in the paper last week. But here is the reported. Here is looking at the effect of our reported fear and changes in social attitudes. Right, so we use the same questions from well-established surveys to basically see how has attitudes toward these groups changed, toward these groups changed over the past during COVID. All right, so the green bar represents the relative fear of different age groups. Surprisingly to me, the most fearful group in a sample were age 30s, whereas the 60-year-olds were sort of less fearful. I actually expected the opposite. I thought COVID was mostly, affecting older people, and they'd be the most fearful. But at least in our data, the 30-year-olds were the most fearful. And it turned out that the 30-year-olds also had the largest increases in pro-social attitudes toward the various groups. right? So in our experiment, we found that, people had more pro-social attitudes toward immigrants, more pro-social attitudes toward Korean Chinese, more pro-social attitude toward foreign workers, and that it was also the 30-year-olds who were the most fearful, had the most increase in pro-social attitudes, and the 60-year-olds who were the least fearful had the smallest increase in pro-social attitudes. We did the same thing by province, right? So we looked at the provinces that had the most fear versus the provinces that had the least fear. And, the results were largely the same, right? So Seoul had relatively more fear, and they had the bigger increases in pro-social attitudes. These other provinces down here had less fear. They had, again, smaller increases in pro-social attitudes. The one exception here was Jeju here, which I think is sort of an outlier in South Korea anyways. It's sort of this resort island that speaks their own language. So it kind of makes sense in a way that they're an outlier, but otherwise it seems like at least the places that had the most fear also had the most change in our survey versus the past GSS surveys conducted in South Korea. All right, and finally, just a brief word about America, just to see, out of curiosity, do these ideas apply to the United States? And so here USC has this really nice survey about COVID in their Understanding America study. All their data is available to download, and to sort of looked in their data, and they had one question that related to fear and one question that related to anxiety. So I just went with that, right? So the fear question was, or the in-group. They didn't have fear exactly, but they had this in-group preference idea, which is, are there too many people hanging around near my home, right? And the fear question was, how much anxiety or worry have you had in the past couple of days? And they find that sort of, in a bunch of specifications, and anxiety and worry are associated with more dislike of strangers, right? And this is true after including fixed effects for person and day fixed effects. This is true for if I include an IV for the number of friends who are hospitalized for COVID. So suggesting that, at least in the US, fear is correlated with more antagonism. And sort of toward reconciling that with our experimental results, I would say that's, arguably due to the selection effect, right? That basically just, we're picking up more conservatives here. It's mostly selection driving these results. All right, so just to wrap up, our results here are relevant for thinking about political persuasion, the effect of COVID-19 on politics in the future, and the impact of fear on the media. And even though we started this paper with actually a pretty pessimistic view, right, about like how COVID is going to create more antagonism, we find the opposite, at least in the context of our experiment, that that fear seems to sort of increase altruism toward outgroups. And we sort of see this in a bunch of other anecdotes, like the New Yorkers clapping nightly for healthcare workers, for the fact that Korean and Spanish language groups top the US pop charts for the first time ever, and record rates of charitable giving. So it's nice to sort of end this with sort of some good news, even though we started this project with a lot of, fearful news. All right, that's it for me. And look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And our discussant is Charles Nasser.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Is it all right? Okay, so let me jump right into a summary of the paper for 1 minute, and then I'll get to my comments. So this paper reports an experiment. The experiment follows a 2x3 design. It is 6 treatments following 2x3 design. One dimension is emotion induction. There's a fear treatment and a happiness treatment in which those emotions are induced. And then the other dimension is information. And the information is about whether a particular individual violated COVID prevention guidelines. And in the 3 treatments, there's one treatment where it's a Korean person, an in-group person, a second treatment with a Chinese person, and a third with a Korean Chinese individual in the news story. A Korean Chinese individual is someone who is of Korean origin but grew up in China and is now working in Korea. So this is a substantial group. There are about 700,000 of them. I went and looked it up. The data that's used for the analysis are the decision to donate to an in-group charity which benefits Koreans, that's the Korean Red Cross, and an out-group charity which benefits Korean Chinese immigrants. They also measured a couple of other things, whether respondents chose to click on a link to seek information about donating to support the education and learning of children in multi-ethnic families. That's an out-group charity. And then there's a survey measuring a variety of variables. It's a big study, over 6,400 people. It's demographically representative. The average age is 47. The main results that are emphasized in the paper. Now, this is a very early version of the paper, and a lot of the results that Ben presented weren't in the paper, the version I received. So it's a very early version. So you know, I expect it to improve a lot. The main results are the results emphasized in the version I had are pretty intriguing. So first of all, reported fear is negatively correlated with donations to the outgroup. Okay, so the more fearful, the less you donate to the outgroup. However, if you induce fear exogenously, then you increase donations to the outgroup. Okay, so they go in the opposite direction. So my general impression is this is an interesting paper. It's a big study. It's very ambitious. It's very careful, and it's very relevant. It's about, you know, bias towards minorities and outgroup members, and it's about COVID-19, which Ben didn't emphasize as much in the talk as in the paper. It's a great illustration of the difference between correlation and causation. So if you look at the correlation between fear and favoritism, you get an opposite conclusion than if you look at the causal relationship. So it's a great illustration how you could go wrong by looking at correlation rather than causation. Okay, so now the correlation or relationship is that those who exhibit in-group bias, who favor the in-group, also tend to exhibit more fear. That's the correlation. Now, what might be the third variable causing both? Well, the paper discusses this a bit, and the suggestion is that it's COVID-19. So COVID-19 induces kind of a fear in many people, and it increases in-group bias in the same people. That's a suggestion I took from the discussion at the end of the paper, and I think it's plausible. Some comments. First, a few comments about the design. Okay, in the design, there are two emotion conditions. There's fear and happiness. And the question I have, I mean, it's discussed in the paper, is why not have a neutral control? And I think you do need to have a neutral control. So I understand the arguments that Ben presented not to have it, so the baseline state is one of fear. But the problem is you can never tell from the results here whether it's fear decreasing favoritism or happiness increasing it. You can't pry those things apart with the design that currently exists. So I really think that a neutral control is necessary or somehow. Two, it's unknown how well mood induction works if you do it online. But I think that the authors have done the best they can. So the memory elicitation technique they use is probably a lot better if you're doing experiments online than showing videos, which is the standard kind of technique right now. If you show video online, to induce fear, people just won't look at it, and you can't tell if they're looking at it or not. So I think they did the best they can. But it seems that the manipulation check, you know, does show that the emotions were induced, but the effect is very weak. So the magnitude of the manipulation check coefficient is very small, and this might be because it's online. And also in the paper, I didn't see quite when the manipulation check was conducted, when you asked people how much fear and happiness they were feeling. So that has to be included in the paper. Third comment is the Korean Red Cross, you know, the authors obviously know much more about this than I do, but that might not be viewed as an in-group charity, because I presume the Red Cross tends to aid everyone, you know, I presume they aid everyone in Korea. So maybe a charity aiding, say, rural farmers or miners specifically might be better, where you know that all the beneficiaries are indigenous Koreans. So for example, when I'm doing a study on in-group preferences among white Americans, I use a charity that benefits coal miners in West Virginia, because everybody has an image that these are Caucasian people that are coal miners in West Virginia. So maybe a charity like that would have been better. A smaller comment here on the design. In the paper, it says that money is awarded to 10 participants, and also somewhere else it says to 10% of participants. So you need to clear that up somewhere in the paper. A couple comments about interpretation of the results. So I think that here, the results on fear induction, it could be, one thing to explore is, what might be happening here is that when fear is induced, it allows you to, what it does is it allows you to attribute it to the experimental manipulation, therefore loses its effect. By that, what I mean is, a subject in this experiment who has fear induced could say, I feel afraid, but I know that it's because the experiment made me recall a fearful experience, and this fear is unrelated to the donation decision. Okay, so
you're out of time, Charles.
Oh, okay. I'll take 10 seconds. So this effect is predicted by affect as information theory. You could look at spatial and intertemporal variation of COVID, and I'm looking forward to results about the information prime. Very interesting project, with valuable implications to understand COVID and emotion research. I'm sorry I ran over. I'm sorry I got wrapped up in.
You're good. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Erin Krupka.
Good. So I think you see my screen. I think you can hear me. I'm going to put it in presentation mode. Good. Okay. So this is joint work with Catherine Eckel, Beminga Ojumu, Tanya Rosenblatt, and Rick Wilson. And our focus is on norm and behavior change in response to COVID-19. And it is with generous support from the NSF as well as a host of research assistants who've been working with us. So the motivation, COVID-19 is a pretty unique challenge because the mitigation strategies, at least early on, now we have a vaccine, but early on required rapid behavior change. And this was also noted in the Haushofer and Metcalf paper, working paper in 2020. And this behavior change is required at the individual level. In other work, social norms have been consistently documented as enabling communities to overcome collective action problems, averting economic and humanitarian crises. And in a recent Nature paper by Bavel et al., it is one of the toolkits, tools in the toolkit that they cover with respect to how one might mitigate COVID-19 spread. Questions we asked ourselves were whether norms can impact behavior here, and if so, which types? And what kinds of norms can emerge quickly enough to meet these challenges associated with COVID? And do we have tools to establish and shape them? There are several working papers that are critical touch points for the work we're doing here. A handful of papers documenting correlations between precautionary behavior and preferences such as risk and impatience. Some showing socioeconomic and gender gaps in behavior and COVID risk tolerance, and others using experimental measures of prosociality, which are correlated with precautionary behavior. And then more narrowly, there are two, Goldberg et al. And Fetzers et al.'s papers, working papers that document correlations between precautionary behavior and norms. In this case, the norms are perceived norms, so they're asking individuals, what do you think one ought to do? And the papers are cross-sectional, so those are important distinctions between what we're going to do and the existing literature. So in this study, we start by motivating with a behavioral premise that actors wish to comply with social norms. We collect data in 3 waves of surveys, April, July, and October of this year from college students. These college students are attending Rice University, Prairie View A&M, and Texas A&M. And Rice University is a private university. Prairie View is a landmark university. And Prairie View is the historically Black college with the 60% female attendance. And Texas A&M is the land-grant university. Each wave asks questions about precautionary behavior. So what things are you doing to engage in social distancing? To curb the spread of COVID-19. And each wave asks incentivized norm measures related to social distancing. So for example, should you avoid large crowds? And do people avoid large crowds? We then use those responses to construct empirical proxies for 2 kinds of norms, descriptive and injunctive norms, using the incentive compatible mechanism, which I'll describe a little bit more in detail in a minute. The 3 research questions that we started with are whether norms can help explain the adoption of contemporaneous precautionary behavior. So what I think should be done to explain my behavior, my precautionary behavior. Is there evidence that norms and behavior related to COVID are changing? And can changes in restrictions and policy impact behavior and norms? So first, let's define the kind of 2 big constructs, the norms that we're going to use. We're going to use injunctive norms, and those are defined as jointly recognized belief regarding the inappropriateness or appropriateness of an action in a specific circumstance. So the key element to this is that norms are jointly recognized. They're collectively understood. Even if we have private disagreements, we understand what the norm is. And often we encounter these as articulations such as one should or one ought to do. The concept of an injunctive norm is not new. It's found now in multiple places in economics. But I want to share a few finer points about this definition that matter for how we elicit norms. So these social norms are constructs. They're social constructs that involve joint recognition by group members that a particular behavior rule exists and applies to the situation. And so we're going to use coordination games. There are several other measures out there or methods out there pioneered by Christina Bicchieri and Eugene Diamant and even Fair et al. Recently, but we're going to use the coordination game feature here. And the other thing that's important to note is that it's not necessarily a binary classification such that a particular action, the norm is, you should tip or do something by assumption, leaving all remaining actions equally inappropriate. Rather, we're going to treat the norm as assigning values of appropriateness to different actions someone could take in a situation, thus constructing a profile of appropriateness. And finally, norms are group level phenomena, and so they vary from group to group. And so it's going to be really important that we identify which groups we're talking about when we ask people about their norms. These are different from descriptive norms, which we define as jointly recognized belief regarding conformity to the injunctive norm. And the key features here are that, again, it's jointly recognized. It is often articulated as, oh, everyone does, or oh, no one follows this. And again, several critical papers document these distinctions. The key intuitions for our group are that injunctive and descriptive norms are often highly correlated, but they aren't necessarily the same thing. So we want to measure both of them. The descriptive norm reflects the observed behavior, often after the injunctive norm has been considered and weighed in with other factors by the decision maker. And it is possible that the injunctive norm lags the descriptive norm. The theoretical framework that I'm whizzing through here is simple motivation for our empirical approach. I just want to put it up here to give you a sense of the kind of framework we have in mind and also the regressions that we're going to run. We have three components here: direct utility, disutility from violating the injunctive norm, and taking an action that deviates from one's descriptive norm. A star here is the ideal action if I had no concern for norms, but we say the agent does care to adhere to the norms associated with these actions, both the injunctive and the descriptive. By modeling as quadratic loss functions, has this nice feature that utility decreases the further away the chosen action is from the ideal action A star, the injunctive norm, and the descriptive norm. And finally, we allow for and hypothesize that there's heterogeneity in norm sensitivity, and those are captured by these weights attached to these two features. And by writing this utility function in this way, we can derive optimal action as a simple weighted average of ideal actions, injunctive, descriptive norms considerations. So the key here is that we assume people want to comply with norms, and we allow for heterogeneity in how they think about that and how much they care about that. The methodology is that we have two samples, two NSF-funded studies, and then received additional NSF funding secured in March. And this paper is going to use focus in on 3 waves of an online survey that were conducted in April, July, and October. We're going to restrict our sample to those who completed all 3 waves, but what I'm going to show you also holds up if we don't. I just think it's easier to think about it this way. And the main modules that we're going to be focusing on are precautionary behavior and the norms modules. We're going to add controls for demographics, as well as use the IP address of the respondents, because they moved between one of the surveys, or some of them did, as universities shut down, to link to Johns Hopkins COVID data to create mortality and morbidity controls at the county level where the respondent is in at the time of their response in each of the waves. And then we're going to use the National Governors Association data to track restrictions and policy mandates at the county level for our analysis of the impact of restrictions or changes in restrictions on norms and behavior. So here's an overview of our survey waves and the active dates. The precautionary behavior index is our primary variable of interest, and we construct it using 5 different questions, all related. They're the same across the 3 waves, and they're all related to things you would do to minimize, comply with social distancing guidelines. The way to think about this index is that 0 means you took no precautionary action, and 100 means you're taking all 5 precautionary actions. These are self-reported. The injunctive norm is going to be captured through the injunctive norm elicitation. The basics of this protocol are coordination game over appropriateness ratings. The incentives for coordination are provided such that somebody's paid if their modal, if their rating matches the modal appropriateness rating at the university. So if I'm a Rice student, I will be told to match with a modal response at Rice. Or among other Rice students. And norms here, the key intuition is that in this environment is that norms act as focal points in the game. So responses generate the empirical proxies that we're going to use for the injunctive norm. And there's a growing literature providing evidence of external validity regarding this protocol. So how did this work in practice? Here's the prompt they received. In particular, we tell them your task is not to rate whether you personally believe the action is socially appropriate, but to guess how most other students participating in this study from your university rate this. And then you can see we have the social distancing action here. So this would be the norm for social distancing. The appropriateness ratings range from very inappropriate to very appropriate, and they're going to be paid if they successfully coordinate. So that's the social distancing question, but we actually have 4 that we repeat over the 3 waves. And from that, again, we construct an index where 0 means that social distancing norms are very inappropriate to 100, which means that taking social distancing practices is very appropriate. So it would be a strong norm. The descriptive norm elicitation follows a similar pattern, except we ask our respondent to think about what most other students believe people are really doing. And again, here the ratings are not over appropriateness, but are over frequency of compliance with the social distancing action, for example. And again, they're paid if they successfully coordinate. We have 4 of those related again to social distancing. And again, we construct an index. So 0 is most are not doing this, and the 100 is most are doing this. Okay, so what are our main results? So the first result we want to look at is whether contemporaneous norms help explain taking precautionary behavior. First, quick overview of our summary statistics and controls. These are the controls that we have in the regression. The only thing I want to point out here is that we have, if you look in the total means, we have about 36% male and 17% Black. And part of the reason those numbers are the way they are is because of the inclusion of Prairie View, which really gives us a very heterogeneous sample and allows us to do some neat things. Johns Hopkins data is below, just gives you a sense. This is just for wave 3, but we of course show it for multiple, we control for it in every wave. All right, so here's the summary means for the precautionary, injunctive, and descriptive norms indices across the waves. First thing I want to point out is the mean of the injunctive norm shows a modest decline from wave 1 through wave 3, meaning norms appear to be weakening, injunctive norms. It also appears that the decline for the descriptive norm is present in this, that people are more pessimistic about others' conformity to social distancing norms by wave 3. Looking at the differences in means between waves and t-testing, whether those are significant, the first thing to point out is that in almost every case, we see evidence of significant change in behavior between the waves. That is, and the KS tests also show distributions are significant between the waves. So though it's a small change, it is significant. The last second thing to note is that the results show a weakening of norms. So for example, wave 1 index is 17.22 points higher than the wave 3 descriptive norm index. The contemporaneous correlate, so we can look at whether contemporaneous correlation between norms and precautionary behavior exists using OLS. Again, these now have controls in them. And the first thing to note is that the injunctive norms index is positively correlated with precautionary behavior in waves 1 and 3. So the way to think about this is that an increase in the injunctive norms index is associated with an 18 point in wave 3, for example, or roughly 1 additional precautionary behavior in wave 3. The descriptive norms index is not correlated with precautionary behavior. Despite declines in that index, it doesn't correlate. So that's the contemporaneous correlation. So now what I want to look at is changes over time. How are these changing over time? So on the left, we've got the injunctive norm index. On the bottom, we have the descriptive norm index. And this is just a quick visualization to show you that norms are positively correlated with each other, but that correlation weakens by the third wave, as you see in the decrease in the slope in the third panel there. Precautionary behavior is now on the y-axis, and the injunctive norms index is on the x-axis. And you see again a positive correlation, but in this case by wave 3, you see that there's a stronger correlation as evidenced by the increase in the slope in wave 3. Looking just at column 3, which includes survey respondent random effects, what we see is that the lag precautionary behavior is correlated with a 24-point or 1 category increase in precautionary behaviors in T+1. Lag norms and descriptive norms index are correlated with a 7 and 8-point increase, respectively. One might think of this as a slower to impact behavior result. And finally, quickly just giving you a sense of, do policies matter? What you see here are the indices plotted as well along over time, just for wave 1, because we don't have the other waves coded up yet for the restrictions. And on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, you see the index ranging from 0 to 100. We've taken the restrictions index from the Governors Association data and coded it so that the ranks range between 0 and 1. So a decline in that index indicates a loosening of restrictions. That black line shows you that over our time period of wave 1, we see a decline, a loosening of the restrictions, okay? So the question is, how does that correlate with norms? What we find using basic OLS regression, again, controlling for, including our controls, is that the norms index is positively correlated with an increase in restrictions. One way to think about that is that more restrictions are correlated with an increase in the norms, that people take their cues from these restrictions. They think about the stronger the restriction, the heavier the restrictions, the higher the injunctive norms index is. So what are the key conclusions that we take away so far from this early work that we've got? One is that norms to take precautionary behaviors, such as you should avoid hanging out with friends, are correlated with taking precautionary behavior. That's good, that's important. Others, compliance with precautionary behavior does not seem to diminish the impact that norms have on precautionary behavior in our window of observation. So norms and policies designed to curb the spread of COVID are weakening relative to March 2020, November 2020 norms to take precautionary behavior are weakening, and the local restrictions are loosening, okay? We show that policies are correlated. That is, people pay attention to the policies and figure out what one should do. Stronger norms are associated with stronger restrictions. And there are some important insights in there for policymakers. Norms matter for precautionary behavior. Policies can make a difference. Norms take time to go into effect, so restrictions curbing behavior may be a better bet to get rapid behavior change than working through them alone. And finally, I'll just conclude by saying it's very preliminary work, and we have some really neat ideas about how to create causality. But for today, I will leave you with these intriguing correlations.
Thank you, Erin. Our discussant is Johannes Haushofer.
Great. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. Great. Thank you very much for the presentations. Thank you everyone for being here. And it was nice to there's a lot of really nice things about it. So briefly, by way of background summary, there's been a flurry of activity looking at the relationship between social preferences and precautionary behaviors during COVID-19. There's a whole bunch of papers now. This paper is unique in that it studies the relationship between precautionary behaviors and descriptive and prescriptive norms. I find those terms easier. So prescriptive here means injunctive norms. As far as I can tell, those are coextensive. So descriptive is what others think people actually do, and prescriptive is what others think people should do. And so there's a number of interesting findings here. Own precautionary behaviors and the norms get weaker over time. The precautionary behaviors correlate with prescriptive, but not with descriptive norms. Prescriptive and descriptive norms are positively correlated with each other. And there doesn't seem to be much of a correlation between this restriction index that they compute, so government restrictions and precautionary behavior, and between the restrictions and descriptive norms, although there does seem to be some correlation between restrictions and prescriptive norms. Okay, so like I said, that there's a number of things that are really nice about this paper. The first, and that makes it different from much of the existing literature, which is sort of resolutely empirical only, is that there's a model to guide the analysis at the beginning based on Aaron's classic work with Roberta Weber. The other really nice feature is that it's panel data. So there's a large survey collection effort in the background here, 3 waves, with quite a large number of students participating in all 3 waves. So that's really nice and will help a lot with what I'm going to say later about getting at causality. The use of incentivized games is really nice and also very different from most of the other work. So many of the existing studies use MTARC or unincentivized panels, at least for the behaviors. You know, obviously people are getting paid for the survey, but the incentives here are really nice. And then the connection to the admin data on lockdowns is really nice as well. That some other studies have done that as well. It's great. This otherwise very unique data set in this fashion. So let me think a little bit about what you could consider doing next with the paper. So the first thought that I have is that it might be nice to establish an even tighter link between the theory and the data. And in particular, it seems like you're currently equating utility and precautionary behavior. So the model is in terms of utility, and then the regression specification that you have has precautionary behavior on the left-hand side. And that's the same as utility if you think that those behaviors are costless. And so it might be nice to think through a little more whether we can make that assumption and maybe what auxiliary assumptions we need for that to be plausible. And then the bulk of the discussion I want to spend on what I think are the 2 obvious empirical issues, namely endogeneity and sample selection. So to deal with the endogeneity issues, what's really nice is that you can look at you've already started looking at these government restrictions. Obviously, those will be partly a consequence of sort of public perception, but I think it's probably as good as it gets to think of those as exogenous, especially, and this is maybe the recommendation, if you can think a little bit about tighter identification strategies. So event studies, for example, in some of these places. The other thing you could consider doing is controlling for actual infection rates, because you would imagine that what drives the perceptions of the government reaction is government actions holding constant what's currently going on in terms of infections. So I think a possible main result, given what you've so far seen in the relationship between government restrictions and preventative behaviors, is that there's not much of a relationship between those restrictions and on behavior and prescriptive and descriptive norms. There's like 10% star there currently. And so if that turns out to be robust, then it would be interesting to think more about why that is. Is it that people don't trust governments, or is it in fact that the restrictions were already anticipated? Governments were kind of following people. And so for that reason, you don't actually see much because people are already doing what the government is only catching up on. In which case you might focus on restrictions that were maybe surprisingly stringent. So then B, and to remind you, B was the selection issue. So you have a student sample here, and not all of them participate in all 3 waves, as you might expect, but having a panel is super helpful. And so one thing you could consider doing is including individual level fixed effects. I couldn't distill into exactly whether that was currently the case, but it seemed like maybe not. So that would give you changes in behavior across waves rather than the lagged specifications that you have at the moment. You might try to get some sense of whether students or parents are choosing where to be, or whether that's based on external factors. So if the school is closing and there's nowhere else to go but home, then you know where the student is when the restriction comes into place is arguably randomly determined or determined by the place of living. If that's not the case, if they're deciding whether they're staying in school or going home based on their preference about which restrictions they want to expose themselves to, that might be a more troublesome assumption. Then finally, for the analysis over time, I thought
You're
that was
out of
interesting,
time,
but
Johanna,
it might,
sorry.
okay, it might benefit from having a crisper question and then put in a table that compares Attritus to others. Great paper. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this.
Yeah, thank you. And our next speaker is Holger Rao.
Okay, I hope that you can hear me and that you can see my slides. So welcome everybody to my talk on the relation of economic preferences and compliance. And this is co-authored with Stefan Müller from the University of Göttingen, who's also part of this audience. Yeah, I'm very happy to present this in this nice session. So this paper was conducted quite early in a survey experiment, which we started right after the beginning of the pandemic in last year's March, when in Germany the first lockdown was set up. Yeah, so actually this is also a reason why it has already some kind of history, and it was recently accepted for publication in the JPUB-E. So let me quickly start with the motivation of the paper. So I think you were all confronted with this kind of pictures during the last months, and we all know the many pictures of the virus and the recommendations to behave during the pandemic. And I mean, it's not a big surprise, because I think the coronavirus is definitely a very, very great challenge, a very, very severe challenge. And there were many policy measures, such as social distancing, which were implemented to break the chain of transmission. And this is also the reason why it's so interesting for us behavioral economists to focus on the behavior of people, right? Because the behavior of people is of crucial importance when it comes to compliance, when it also comes to sticking to policy measures. And especially important is individual social compliance. So what do we mean with social compliance? So it defines some concept which relies to the adherence to the recommendations and regulations regarding public health, right? And at the same time, it shares public good characteristics, which makes it additionally very important for behavioral economists. Yeah, if you think about some behavior during the crisis, if you think about some social distancing behavior, such as staying at home, it's quite clear that it has some similar characteristics, such as in a public good game, right? So it has positive externalities if you stay at home and if you protect elderly people. And at the same time, you may also suffer some disutility, I would say. Yeah? You may feel lonely and you can't meet friends. And this is the trade-off you're basically facing when you think about sticking to social distance. Right. And interestingly, at the time when we started with our project, so people really didn't know a lot about the individual drivers of compliance in those public good contexts, especially if you think about social compliance in the presence of the corona crisis, which was very new when we started with our project. And our idea was definitely that individual preferences may be related to people's behavior during the crisis. And actually, we started focusing on economic preferences for different reasons, right? We all know a lot about economic preferences, and it's very interesting also from a theoretical point of view, what we're doing in lab experiments, whether we can transfer it to real life behavior. And yeah, we thought about candidates which could be predictive for people's behavior during the crisis. And we found okay, definitely risk preferences should be related, because it's kind of playing a gamble, right? If you get out there and if you meet people and if you stick to social distancing rules or not. And because, yeah, you have the risk of getting infected, and therefore it's quite intuitive to think that risk-averse people are less likely to get out there. And at the same time, we thought about policy measures, and the idea was, okay, that should be related to time preferences, because there's a lot of evidence in terms of in terms of health behaviors, where it was shown that patients matters, and also in terms of policy measures. It's quite clear that if you can stay, or if you have to stay home, that you need to be patient, right? Because you have to wait until the lockdown was finished and until you can get out again. And what's also quite clear is when it comes to individual behavior, that trust is very important, because I mean, there's many interpersonal relations which matter out there, and therefore we thought that media reporting is definitely connected to trust, right? At the same time, you may also think about what politicians are saying, right? If you're not trusting politicians, maybe you're less likely to stick to the policy measures. That was the starting point, actually, when we started off with our project. And what do we exactly do in this paper? So more or less, we are focusing on some kind of prediction task. So actually, we're trying to find out whether we can predict behavior during the crisis, whether we can predict compliance, and we do it basically based on 2 dimensions. As a first dimension is more or less based on what we call key economic preferences. So we selected the measurement of risk preferences, time preferences, trust, and honesty, and we trying to test whether this may predict citizens' compliance behavior during the corona crisis. At the same time, we also trying to find out whether socially responsible citizens are more likely to behave compliant during the corona crisis. So here again, we're also trying to predict their behavior. However, the difference is that our predictors are different. I will come to this later. So what we are doing is we focus on an online questionnaire where we're actually measuring subjects' economic preferences and their behavior in situations relevant to social responsibility. And at the same time, we're also measuring our outcome variables, and these are based on self-reported reactions to policy measures and the perception of the crisis. But I will only focus on the first kind of outcome variables. In the second, so the second part is reported in our working paper version, and also for reasons of time, I will only focus on the compliant behavior. So what can we do with our findings? So of course, the goal is that we can help policymakers and organizations to identify people, right? This relates to risk groups. You may think about occupational groups because there's some evidence that different occupational groups, they differ in terms of risk preference, right? So you have evidence that people working in high income areas are characterized by more risk tolerant behavior. And at the same time, you may also apply this concept to regions or countries which might also be at risk in times of crisis, which makes it a bit more globally. Yeah? So you may think about organizations, you may think about regions of risk. Yeah? So that's the idea of this prediction experiment. And yeah, what's also very much important, it was already discussed by the discussant of the previous paper by Johannes. So of course, what matters is the subject pool. And similarly, as in the previous paper, we're also focusing on students. So we have a student subject pool, and we collected this data in the very beginning of the pandemic in March 16 and on March 17. And so we focused on our student subject pool for several reasons. So actually we wanted to quickly collect data, and we had convenient and easy access to this kind of data. And our students were paid a €5 Amazon voucher for participation. So there was a fixed compensation, so we did not apply incentivized measures. However, I mean, of course, you may argue that this is not a representative subject pool. Of course, you're right. However, and that's important, this is also our main selling point, because for our study topic, students are representative in the sense that they account for 25% of the German population within the age cohort between 20 and 29. And this is quite important, especially for our research question, because there's a lot of evidence showing that actually, especially this age cohort is least compliant to social distancing. So there's several arguments that it's really important that you focus on this age group. And at the same time, this is also quite interesting. There's also additional advantages of applying some student subject pools. So in a recent paper by Snowberg and Yarif, which was recently also accepted for publication in the AAR, there's some evidence that the behaviors of student subject pools correlate with data of a representative US population subject pool. And at the same time, they also argue that students or student subject pools show less measurement error, which is also quite important in terms of identification issues. And finally, and I think maybe you can also elaborate on this in your paper, I'm not sure about your data or your old data. So what we did is we used our subject pool, and we also focused on all data which we had from all laboratory experiments. When you focus on experiments, I think most of you also have all data on preferences or behavior of students. And what we did was kind of we compared this data with the current data which we got in our survey. And this also increased the internal validity, because we found that the old preference data did not differ from our data which we collected at this time. I'm not saying that I'm not believing that there's no preference changed because of the corona pandemic, but at the very beginning of our experiment, which was in March, we did not expect a behavioral change, and we also don't observe this, which is quite nice because this allows us this comparison. So regarding our questions, we focused on different groups of questions. So in the beginning, we did not mention at all that the study was about corona. So we just focused on a group of economic preference questions. We elicited them verbally. So we focused on questions about trust, trustworthiness, honesty, risk tolerance, and patience. And okay, it was not incentivized. However, there were some experiments or some papers already showing that this kind of measures were validated. Yeah? So there's high correlations to incentivized measures, which is good news. So in the Falk paper, which came out recently, they also show that this is highly correlated to incentivized measures. At the same time, and this is what I talked about at the beginning, we also focused on social responsibility. So what did we do? We asked people about their behavior in terms of fare evasion in public transportation. So how often they do fare evade in public transportation, and how often they actually go to the election. So we focused on turnout, voter turnout. And finally, we also thought that this is very interesting. We asked them about their agreement to vaccination, but this was not related or not directly related to the coronavirus. So actually here, we focused on the vivid debate which we had in Germany some months ago. This was on a compulsory law on the compulsory vaccination of school kids. It was about the measles vaccination. And so we asked them about their agreement to this law, which we also think that it's a nice proxy for people's social responsible behavior. What we did with the data was we ran some principal component analysis. And what we got, was 3 principal components. So one which had trustworthiness and honesty loading highly and positively. In the second one, we had loadings of risk tolerance and patience, so risk tolerance loaded negatively. And finally, which we call our social responsibility index. So we had a principal component which includes the social responsible behavior. Finally, we had a last group of outcome variables, which was based on the behavior during the crisis, so on staying home behavior, so whether they increased staying home during the crisis and whether they increased the avoidance of crowds during the crisis, and also whether they were likely to do a COVID-19 test when observing symptoms of the virus. And we also asked them about their purchases of food, so whether they engaged in panic buying during the crisis. And so actually we computed an index based on that, but the index does not include the panic buying, because with the Cronbach alpha measurement, we found out that only the first 3 components are very much related. Therefore, we report on the results of panic buying isolatedly. So these are the main results on OLS regressions on the compliance index. So basically we include the principal components and some controls on present bias of people, also on the timing, which is called day 2, whether we conducted the survey on the first or on the second day. And the second model, we also include demographics. And what you can see here is there's a positive relationship between patience and compliance. So more patient people are also more compliant. At the same time, we also can interpret this finding that if you're more risk tolerant, you're also less compliant, because risk tolerance enters negatively. And at the same time, we also find that the other predictors are correlated to compliance. So we also find that social responsible people are significantly more compliant. So this is basically our social responsibility index. And finally, this is also quite interesting, what we do is we focus on a disaggregated analysis of our compliance index to get some more insights on the direct relations of economic preferences and behavior. So we focused on staying home behavior, avoidance of crowds, and COVID-19 testing in models 3, 4, and 5. What you can see here is that, again, social responsibility is significantly and positively correlated to staying home. That is If you're social responsible, you stay home more often, and at the same time, you also avoid, or more often avoid crowds. And the same holds for patients. This also helps to stay home, and this also helps to avoid crowds. And risk tolerance is negatively related. So if you're a more risky person, you less often avoid crowds, which also makes sense if you think about this situation as kind of a gamble. But interestingly, we did not find any relation between COVID-19 testing. And finally, which is also quite interesting, if you focus on panic buying, you also find that present bias people, thank you, are more likely to engage in panic buying. And this is also a bit, I mean, it's intuitive if you think about those guys as, facing self-control problems. And at the same time, we find a significant correlation, a negative correlation between risk tolerance and panic buying. And if you think about purchases as sort of an insurance concept, it also makes sense that if you're risk averse, you're more likely to do the panic buying. Okay, this is also about some external validity. For us, it was important to get some insights about external validity. So we focused on our social responsibility measure, which is quite interesting because we have the data of students' behavior in the laboratory experiment. So we exploit this data. So as you all know, of course, we have some data on attendance rates in former laboratory experiments. What we do basically is we link former attendance rates of laboratory experiments of our participants in the subject pool, and we're trying to find whether there's a correlation between the self-reported score and social responsibility. So we think if you're more often showing up to laboratory experiment, this may be a proxy for social responsibility. And this is nice. We also find a significant positive correlation. So if you're more often showing up, you also have a higher score in the social responsibility measure. I mean, this is not so strong, but here we are also losing power because we don't have the data of all the people. But I find it's quite nice. And what's also important is, of course, the external validity of our economic preferences. So here we can argue, okay, we have verbal measures. However, they were validated in several studies, which is good news. And at the same time, we also have this honesty measure. And we were testing whether there's some correlation between honest behavior and the answers given to the preference measures. And we find no correlation at all, which is also some kind of indication at least. Finally, to wrap up, I will wrap up very quickly. What we found here is that the study finds that patients and risk aversion and social responsibility are related to higher social compliance. And this is quite interesting because the findings facilitate the identification of target groups for the allocation of surveillance. And what can we do with this? So our social responsibility measure is quite nice because maybe in real life we have observables about this behavior. Maybe you can focus on grid data on voter turnout or vaccine rates or fare evasion to predict in which kind of reasons people are more, in which kind of regions people are more or less compliant, which is another insight for a policymaker. And at least for economic preferences, you may have indirect evidence. If you know that in different occupations, people are characterized by different economic preferences. But of course, the problem is the identification of economic preferences in real life. Therefore, we really like our social responsibility measure because here you can focus on grid data. And finally, we believe that this is quite interesting because we all know that there's a lot of variation in terms of economic preferences worldwide, which was shown in a recent FILE paper. And therefore, maybe, therefore, you need more data, of course, but maybe our findings may also provide some insights for organizations such as the WHO to get some ideas about different countries and about preference differences. So in order to identify countries which might be at a higher risk than other countries. So that's all from me. I hope I don't run out too much of time.
It's perfect time for your discussion, Linda Thunstrom.
Great.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Holger. Okay, so I can't screen share. Okay, not yet. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Oops. Goodness, you see the end of my slideshow now. I'm going to go back to the beginning. There we go. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me here and for letting me comment on this very interesting paper. And thank you for your presentation too, Holger. So I did not include a summary because this is a fairly straightforward paper. What Stefan and Holger are doing is they're looking at the correlation between economic preferences, so time preferences, risk preferences, trust, and honesty, and the compliance with social distancing as well as panic buying. When they look at time preferences, they separate those into two. So they look at the underlying patients, so that would be your underlying discount rate, and then whether people are present bias, so whether they have inconsistencies in their discount rate over time. They also look at whether social responsibility increases compliance with social distancing, and they find that it does. And in general, most of the findings in this paper are fairly intuitive. Stefan and Holger find what you would expect them to find, essentially, which is nice for the most part. So that is good. And I found the paper very interesting and informative. So and of course, this is a paper that is already forthcoming. So my comments are going to be a little mute at this point, but that's fine. And I also really liked about the paper that, you were able to use previous experiments to look into the stability of your measures or the validity of your measures, I should say, and also, how the preferences in your group compared to previous experiments. So, and then you're saying that, students student pool in this paper is actually the selling point of the paper, which is good. I mean, I think I agree with you that students are an important group to study here. Now, however, what I wonder though is, because you also say that students have similar economic preferences, but they have a different behavior when it comes to COVID-19. So you're saying that they are less likely to comply with social distancing, for instance. So to what extent can we extrapolate the results from this subject pool then to the general population when we know that the behavior is different? So that was a discussion that I would have been interested in seeing in the paper. Also panic buying, I'm not sure, but I think when I went to the survey, I think you define panic buying as just increasing purchases of staple goods. And I'm not sure I would agree that that is panic buying. Most of us probably did that because we didn't go out to restaurants as much as we otherwise did, right? Oh, I only have 1 more minute, oh my gosh. And then I missed discussions of other literature that have also incorporated economic preferences. And you, for instance, you cite the Campos and Mercado et al., but you don't discuss the results on time and risk and trust preferences. Policy implications. Okay, that will be my last one. You talk about how this can be used to determine, how to allocate medical and surveillance resources. And I think it can. I agree with that to some extent, but I also think that maybe there are other dimensions than just compliance as to how to allocate those resources, right? Vulnerability, for instance, to the virus. And it's not even clear to me, and you don't discuss that in the paper, if people who comply more, are they supposed to get more medical resources? Or are they supposed to get less medical resources, right? So I think I need to stop there, but I do think this is great work, and I would love for you to do a follow-up where you could look at how preferences might have changed across the pandemic, and if the correlation between behavior and preferences might have changed.
Thank you, Linda. And our next speaker is Francesco Bagliacino.
Sorry.
Okay. First of all, thanks, Catherine and the ASSA for organizing this session. I'm Francesco Bagliacino from Universidad Nacional in Colombia. This is joint work with a bunch of colleagues from University of Milan, University of Tilburg, University of Catalonia, and University of Trento. This is also part of a larger project that we launched in March on COVID, and I'm gonna say a few words later on just that you understand the data collection, which I think is important. So I'm showing here on the left a first page from the New York Times, which I'm sure you are familiar with. On the very top, there is this the trend in the labor market, which show essentially this huge slump in April, which makes all previous crises negligible, including the Great Recession that you see there. And this is just an example of the kind of shock that people suffered because of health or because of labor market during the so-called first wave of COVID. We define negative economic shock as losses of income or losses of accumulated wealth. And in this paper, we try to answer essentially two questions. The first one is that if having suffered shock during this crisis, predict differences in terms of cognitive function and preferences, a large set of preferences. The second thing is that we manipulate a recall of stressful and negative effect event to see if stress and negative effect drives the differences that we expect to see. Okay, so I'm just, you're all familiar with this outcome variable. I'm just briefly define them. So cognitive function is a set of top-down processes that you use in making decisions where you cannot rely on intuition. Time preferences and patience refer to the willingness to give something today for a larger sum tomorrow. Risk aversion, the accepting a certain amount X in exchange for a lottery was expected value is higher. And social preferences refer to showing other regarding concern when it is costly and does not involve strategic consideration. Why are these outcome variables relevant? Well, for theoretical reason. We explain decision through preferences, beliefs, and constraint, which include, of course, cognitive constraint. So, if preferences and constraint changes, decision may change and outcome may change, but also there is a bunch of work in the literature that shows that this outcome correlates with the welfare both at the individual and the aggregate level. For example, delay of gratification predict income, risk aversion and time discount are very correlated with the level of development of the country, and trust and other pro-social preferences are systematically correlated with the efficiency of the institutional system in a country and so on. We are not, of course, the first one to study shocks. Shocks are normally mild when they are suffered by a household, and they can be insured. But when we look at the aggregate shock, this can be more difficult, and this is also important from a policy point of view. So things like the natural disaster are, as in the top left panel, poverty, because you can be poor because of shock, or you can suffer shock when you're poor, or like internally displaced population or violence, as in the left right panel, or of course macroeconomic volatility, and in particular huge crisis or deep recession, as the Great Recession that I'm showing there, is what normally people has studied. So the related literature and our contribution is that the normal people study these shocks with losses induced in the lab on the game from real effort task or plausible exogenous variation of income or assets, and they show that act as a cognitive toll. They show that tend to be associated with the higher time discount. We have more puzzling evidence with regard to risk aversion, in the sense we had both risk loving and risk aversion after suffering shock, depending on the type of shock that people are studying. And there seems to be a tendency from violence-related shock and from natural disaster to see more pro-social preferences. So what we do essentially is we look at all these outcome variables together. We look with very externally valid measure of shock, although of course we cannot manipulate them. And we look with a representative sample in 3 countries. In terms of causal mechanism, the literature are essentially proposed as a relationship between shock and cognitive function. This idea of stress and negative effect associated with shock that can generate this negative effect on cognitive function. And you're reviewing the literature that induce stress or fear via fear induction or either cortisone or electric shock, they show an increase in risk aversion and time discount. And we can also extend this explanation to an increase in prosocial preferences if we admit the social heuristic hypothesis, which is essentially a dual process model in which people, because of the cognitive toll, the system one becomes more salient and people becomes more cooperative if we assume that being cooperative is the intuitive decision, or from a more neuroeconomic point of view, negative affect can induce more prosocial behavior if to undo the effect of the negative emotion. So our contribution is that try to assess this generalized explanation for the link between shocks and preferences across all these outcomes. So I'm just making a reference here to the general study. That this was a study that we started in April. It's a longitudinal studies in Italy, Spain, and England. And we were interested in different things. So we have 3 waves. In each wave, we have a specific module. So what I'm discussing here is taken from wave 2, but we have some longitudinal measures that are used in the analysis that I'm showing you. So we launched data collection on April 24. We have 3 data points. We end at the beginning of June, and we have specific module every week. So these are the data from wave 2. It's about 4,800 participants, 1,600 in each of the 3 countries, Italy, Spain, and UK. Just at the beginning of the survey, people is answering a recall, okay? The recall is either of, the treatment condition is stressful or negative effect recall, or a control. And next slide, I'm clarifying exactly the recall. Then they answer the outcome variable, which are the cognitive reflection text by Friedrichs and the global preference survey by Falk and co-authors. All these measures are experimentally validated. And then we use the question that comes after and the question from the first wave, either as control or to measure shock. And we measure shock in 4 different ways. Either a labor market shock, so losing the job or having a reduction of income, or health shock, measured in the first way related to taking specific action because of COVID, getting testing and going to the doctor and so on. Third way to measure shock, having suffered more than the median of a stressful event, which include, having to look for shelter, apply for a subsidy, homeschooling children, and so on. And then we have a published paper from the data from the first wave, in which we use a machine learning algorithm to predict people at risk of stress, anxiety, and depression based on economic vulnerability. And we use that prediction as a further measure of shock in the analysis. Regarding the recall, we have a recall of negative emotion. We have a recall of stress, and then we have 2 control conditions, actually. One is the neutral recall, and the other is the joy recall. The reason we did this is that we were afraid that COVID was so salient that it was coming out also in the neutral. So we wanted, in any case, also a joy to make sure that we have enough variation. And also, in case we get result, this was a way to make sure that we have a pre-designed falsification test that we can use. In any case, there are no difference between neutral and joy, and so we treat this as control group together. So the result, the first set of results that I'm showing, these are OLS regression, where the outcome is regress on the dummy of shock, a set of control from the first wave, and of course the experimental condition here. Okay, so here I have 4 panels in which I'm showing the estimation of B1, and of course the 4 panels refer to the 4 different measures of shocks. And then I have the outcome variable. Okay, the coefficient will be standardized in point of standard deviation, and the confidence interval is estimated with Romano and Wolf to make sure that we control for multiple hypothesis testing. So this is what comes out. Essentially, we have a systematic negative correlation with cognitive reflection tests, as we were expected. We have, contrary to our hypothesis, we have an increase in risk-taking. Sorry, an increase, no, a positive correlation with risk-taking. And then we have a systematic correlation with at least one measure of social preferences. We were expecting to see more, which is negative reciprocity. Note that regardless of how we measure shock, these effects are more consistent. The other are either non-consistent across measure or across country. One important thing is that if we do Olm instead of Romano-Wolf, we get essentially the same picture. You can also think that all the prosocial preferences are actually not independent assumption and do a composite index that we did extracting the first component from the data. Actually, sorry, Wemba, because these were not in the paper you were asked to read. They are just controlled that we did in the last 2 weeks. But essentially, when we use a composite index, is that we get an effect on prosocial preferences, at least when we measure shock as labor shock, as stressful event shock. Then I'm going to show you this regression where we use the interaction between having to recall a stressful or negative event and having been exposed to shock. So again, on top, we will have the outcome variable. And here we will have 4 rows, which correspond to the 4 set of regression. And I'm showing here the coefficient, the estimation from beta 3, okay, from our regression. This part is, of course, related to try to assess the causal explanation, generalized, referring to stress and negative effect, and we essentially get a 0. Okay, so we don't have consistent evidence that this is actually what is driving these differences that we found. Of course, this is, the priming, as Charles was mentioned, is probably the best thing that you can do in an online environment, but for sure it's not as strong as other manipulation like fear induction, for example, that you can do in the lab. So essentially we get a 0 in terms of lack of evidence on this. In terms of robustness check, I've said a bunch of things. We did also the regression using separately stress and negative effect recall interacted with shock. We use different set of control from the first wave, but the results are essentially unchanged. Another thing that is important is that you may be afraid that the attrition between wave 1 and wave 2 can affect the result, because of course the sample was representative in wave 1, but then we have some attrition. So we estimated with the random forest the probability of dropout from wave 1 and wave 2, and we ran regression using the inverse of this probability as analytical wave, and the results are absolutely unchanged. And this is important also in terms of external validity. So in terms of heterogeneity, I'm showing here the result by country using the measure of stressful event. So having suffered more than the median of stressful event, just because these are clearer, but the results are qualitatively the same if we use the different measure of shock. And you can see first that, negative reciprocity, risk-taking, and cognitive reflection tests show up essentially in all the 3 countries as in the general result. There seems to be more things going on in Spain, where we have also an impact on time discounting and on trust and positive reciprocity. In Italy, we have a negative impact on one of the measures of altruism, but is not consistent across the 2 measures. And in general, these results are, except for the 3 main results, are again, different depending on the way in which you measure shock as well. Well, actually, this is my last slide. So I'm just summing up. So we were expecting in our assumption a negative correlation between shock and cognitive reflection test, and a positive, a negative effect on sorry, a positive effect on risk aversion and time discounting, and a positive effect on social preferences. We found some of these results in terms of one of the measures of social preferences and cognitive reflection test. We found a result contrary to our assumption in the case of risk aversion. Of course, here we are not manipulating the shock, but it's interesting that we can replicate the results, for example, from other paper that use induce shocks in the lab. Our main explanation for this negative correlation was negative affective stress. Revising the literature, we tried to assess it using this recall. In this inducing of emotion and stress. Well, we couldn't find, but again, this is a very mild manipulation. And yeah, the main added value is, of course, that we are using a representative sample. We are providing evidence from 3 countries that were severely affected by COVID. So we don't know, of course, how they can be generalized, but then, after this first wave, COVID affected quite strongly most of the country, actually. And again, the outcome variable, of course, are not incentivized, but all are experimentally validated. So I'm gonna stop here and leave the floor to Gwenga for, I'm eager to listen to his comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Our discussion is Benga Ajumo.
Okay. Good morning again, everyone, and afternoon and evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be able to review this paper, and I thank the organizers again. Very interesting paper, if I must say. So very interesting paper and very interesting results as well. Of course, the general ideas about this paper is that negative shocks predict change in cognitive function and preferences. And of course, this is supported by several literature, which is also shown by this paper as well. And specifically, as we all know, the COVID-19, has presented all kind of problems. And, from this paper, it shows that it's a double-edged negative shock, which of course, people either get sick or are afraid of getting sick. And also the lockdown has presented a different type of fear for people, or stress, where people are afraid of losing their jobs, income, and not able to meet some of their obligations. And this paper has done very well, particularly in focusing on the danger of the COVID and the response of different governments on the lockdown to look at the cognitive function and preferences. And of course, the mechanism approach here is looking at being able to use the stress channel to do this, which is very intuitive. Quickly, the strength of this paper really is that it's the size, and it cuts across several countries, Italy, Spain, and UK, which is very great. And especially because it started really early at the beginning of this pandemic, which is very strong. And of course, it helps us to be able to see how this affects going forward. And quickly, some of the key elements that we see in this paper, the very simple measure of cognition, how to use that's the one, specifically the one by Frederick. Also, the experimentally validated survey questions used in this study, to be able to elicit the risk aversion, time preferences, altruism, and reciprocity of the respondents. And also, we look at the measure of the different types of shock. Most of the other papers that are out there focus on only single measures, looking at maybe labor market or the health. But this paper has done well, to be able to articulate all of these different type of shocks. And of course, the experimental manipulation, is very, very unique, being able to have different groups and also the control as well. So it's very, very interesting. And some of the results also, even though, yes, I think this one was on the second wave, very interesting result, which shows us that lower cognitive function, you know, and higher discount rates, you know, all of these are affected by these shocks. And specifically, we look at it, this paper shows that the negative effect of cognitive performance at various degrees, not exactly the same. And of course, this should be expected because we are looking at different countries and the, you know, the large number of data sets. And also we see the positive effect of risk propensity and also positive effect of negative reciprocity here. Of course, and also the country level results. So show some heterogeneity, which is very good as well, because of course the policies or the approach by different governments are also expected to be different. However, we look at the experimental manipulation, which showed weak effect. I was a little bit disappointed here, but of course, it's what the data shows. So some considerations real quickly. We see that it's very, you know, some of the provoking questions here that we can see is that some of these results, you know, they go both ways. So being that they go both ways, how can we continue to view this? What will be the best measure of how to elicit preferences and all that? Because some literature show they support it and some do not. So also the some of these experimentally validated survey measures, how can we validate them? Because some of them were used for students, when there was no problem, there was no shock, you know, and of course these were used as well. So going forward, it will be very interesting to see what's going to be able to, what you'll be able to do with this paper. But of course, the current results are very interesting as well, as it supports, you know, some of the past literatures and also in different ways. So another thing is, yes, it's longitudinal. So it's be very interesting to see as the waves goes on, as we go forward, we'll be able to see whether we can unfold how preferences change and also as you go along in this paper. But overall, it's an interesting paper. So it's a unique opportunity for you to be able to study the evolution of preferences across countries, and also hopefully you'll be able to put time on when the governments actually came up with the policies of control in different countries. So thank you. I appreciate having been able to discuss this paper. Very interesting and intriguing results. Thank you.
Thank you, Benga. Our last
Thanks
paper
for the
today is
comments.
presented by Yi Xin.
Okay, let me start. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining this session. My name is Yi Xin. I'm currently Assistant Professor of Economics at Caltech, and I'm very happy to talk about this joint work with my colleagues, Matt, Lawrence, and Colin, and also Jessica Fong from University of Michigan. Okay, let me now just quickly jump into the motivation of this paper. So changes in human behavior are quite interesting and important, but those changes could be caused by many different reasons and thus are generally difficult to predict. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic, however, provides us with a unique opportunity to observe a large-scale behavior changes in many different domains. As consumers are essentially forced to experiment when their earlier choices now become unavailable. For example, we observe the restaurants, they quickly switch to delivery services, and the schools start doing online teaching, and people use social media more than ever. Okay. So the main goal of our paper today is trying to understand the long-term impact of forced experimentation using the field data. Specifically, we are interested in understanding whether these changes can persist after the pandemic is over, and also does the forced experimentation eventually lead to habituation. Okay. So in this paper, we collected fine-grained activity data from the pandemic period to test a novel neuroscience-based model of habit formation, that is the neural autopilot model. Our data are from the social media platform from China, and you can think of that as a Chinese version of Twitter, and the name of the platform is Weibo. So in our data set, there are a couple of benefits of using this data. So first of all, in China, the lockdown is pretty homogeneous and it's quite strict. It's almost the strictest around the world. And in our data, we collect a complete timeline of postings for postings and platform activities for about 20,000 users all the way until July 2020. And by then, the lockdown has been listed for a list of 3 months, and the pandemic situation was pretty much under control in China. Okay, so in the sense that in our data, we were able to observe people's behavior before, during, and also after the lockdown. And additional benefits of using this data set is that actually there is no pecuniary incentives for people to adopt Weibo. And this helps us to identify users' inherent preferences rather than their responses to just to monetary payouts. Okay. Finally, in this data set, we actually have access to some measures of reward for people's behavior. For example, if you think about posting online, actually, people can receive likes, comments, retweets from other people, and you can think of those as a reward to the posting behavior. And this plays an important role in our model, which I will explain just in a couple of slides. Okay. Yeah, in our analysis, we focus on 2 groups of the users, the ones who joined before 2020 and also the ones who joined after 2020. We call the first group the early adopters and the other one the late adopters. Okay, so as you can imagine, the early adopters, they are more likely to voluntarily adopt the Weibo, where the late adopters, they join the platform around the same time when the pandemic started. So they're more likely to actually force to do so in order to keep in touch with their friends or to receive some up-to-date news. Okay, so the figure here below basically shows you some empirical pattern of posting behavior for the late and early adopters separately. And this is just completely based on our raw data. And clearly you can see from this figure that the Weibo usage increased for both early and later adopters amid the lockdown in China. And however, as the lockdowns are eased, the late adopters experienced a more precipitous drop in their Weibo usage. Okay. So at least at face value, this figure seems to suggest that the forced experimentation may not actually lead to a very persistent habituation. The differences between the early and late adopters also look quite interesting. So why are they behave differently? It is because that they may have differences in their habituation process, or it could just simply because the late adopters and the early adopters have different preferences over the choices. Okay. So in order to better understand the long-term impact of forced experimentation and also to decompose this channel habituation channel versus the preference channels, the next in our paper, we're going to fit the data to a structural model that is the neural autopilot model. Okay, so this is a novel model of habituation, which takes broad cues from decision neuroscience. And it's quite different from the conventional habit formation model in economics, where in that literature, people typically assume that your utility for goods and utility for goods and services depend on the past assumption. Okay. Yeah. Now let me give you a little bit more details about our model. Okay. So in our model, the agent can choose from a set of 2 options. So we use A1 to represent the behavior of posting online, and A0 to represent agent's offset option. And we use CT to denote the agent's purity choice. So the autopilot model essentially assumes that human brain can switch between 2 distinctive modes of decision making, the habit mode versus the goal-directed mode. Okay. Well, in the habit mode, people just automatically repeat what they did in the last period. So you can see from the first line of this equation, CT equals to CT minus 1. While in the goal-directed mode, people will consider all available options and are more likely to choose the ones that gives them a higher reward. Okay, so you can see from the second line of this equation, the probability that an action is chosen depends on depends on the agent's prediction for the reward for each alternative in the choice set. Okay. Here we're using this RAT to measure the reward prediction for option A, and throughout the decision-making process, this reward prediction will be updated for the agent, and the updating process essentially depends on some experienced utility or experienced reward the agent can receive from choosing this behavior. Okay. So in our model, we also specify the switching rule between the habit versus the goal-directed mode, but in the interest of time, I will just skip the details. Overall, intuitively, you can imagine that when the reward is sufficiently reliable, then it's more likely that the agents are stuck in the habit mode. On the other hand, if the reward is less reliable, then the agents are more likely to switch to the goal-directed mode and explore other available options. Okay, so the important novelty of our model is that we actually explicitly take into account the underlying process of habit formation. So in our model, the habituation parameters include, for example, we call the learning rate, and this parameter essentially measures how sensitive the agents respond to new information when they update their reward prediction or when they update their reward reliability. So there are other habituation parameters in our model, such as some parameters which govern the stochastic switching rule, but I don't have time to go into details. Okay. The other part of our model primitives is more conventional in a sense that it actually more related to the agent's tastes for different alternatives. Okay, therefore we call this the other part of the parameters, the preference parameters. Okay, remember in our model, the agent receives some experience utility from their choices. For example, if the agent chose to post online, he can actually receive likes, comments, or retweets from other people, and this can be used as the experience utility for the option of posting online. Okay, and this is something we directly observe in the data, as I mentioned at the beginning. Well, if the agent, on the other hand, chose not to post online and choose some outside option, he can also receive the experience utility for that option, but this is unfortunately not available in the data set we collected. And in the end, we're gonna treat this experience utility for the outside option as a parameter to be estimated. Okay, so in practice, we take our data to this model and we estimate the model primitives using the maximum likelihood. So in the interest of time, I will skip the identification argument for these structural parameters, but I'm definitely happy to talk more about it after this talk. Okay. Okay, the next slide basically presents you our estimation results for the model primitives for the early versus the late adopters separately. Okay, by comparing this between these two different groups, you can see that obviously both channels, the differences in their habituation parameters and also the differences in their preference parameters are both present. If we first focus on this red part and comparing their habituation parameters, you can see that actually for early adopters, they have a higher learning rate than the late adopters, and therefore they are likely to adjust faster compared to the other group. Now, if we look at these numbers in blue, the first observation is that we actually allow the reward utility for outside option to differ before lockdown and during the lockdown. And our estimation results shows that actually the reward utility, the experience utility for the outside option decreased quite a lot during the lockdown period, which exactly explains why you see an increase in people's usage of the social media platform during that period. And if you further compare the estimates of preference parameters between early versus the late adopters, we see that in general, the late adopters have a higher value for the outside option. Therefore, they are relatively care less about these likes or comments received from the platform. And this also explains why these people do not become easily habituated to posting online. Okay. Yeah, to further see the role of the habituation channel in explaining the differences between the early versus the late adopters, we did the following exercise, basic simulation exercise. Okay, so in this exercise, we replace the late adopters' habituation parameters by those from the early adopters, and then we simulate their behavior. So in this figure below, the blue and the red curves are exactly what you see at the beginning of this talk. So they're just posting behavior for early and late adopters using the raw data. And this green curve are the ones we actually simulated after making these changes. Okay, clearly you can see that after we shutting down the habituation channel, the habituation, this parameter plays an important role in terms of the slope of these curves. And that is how quickly this user can actually adjust their behavior when they join the platform and also when they receive some like exogenous shocks because of the pandemic. Okay. Yeah, so we can also see the effects of the preference channel via a very similar exercise. So here in this slide, we are basically replacing the late adopters' preference parameters by those from the early adopters. Again, these green curves are the ones that actually shows you the simulation results. And you can see that after we make the outside option for the late adopters less attractive, the posting behavior, the posting probability increased quite a lot in our simulation. And this tells you how important the preference parameters matter for the level change of agents' behavior. Okay. Yeah, so in this slide, what we're showing is that when both channels are present, in the sense that we simulate agents' behavior using exactly, we simulate the late adopters' behavior using exactly the estimated parameters we got from our MLE. And this green curve, again, it's the simulation results. Based on this figure, our conclusion is that basically the model can replicate the empirical pattern very well. And this green curve is pretty much close to what we really see in the data, which is this red one. Okay. Yeah, so using our structural model estimates, in our paper, we conduct a couple of counterfactual analysis. So the first counterfactual here is trying to understand the long-term impact of forced experimentation. So in this exercise, what we did is that we simulate the behavior path for about 10,000 hypothetical users using the model estimates for early and late adopters separately. And what we did is that we suppose everybody starts from day 1 and we simulate their behavior all the way until day 1200, and we impose a lockdown at day 500, and the lockdown lasts for about 2000. Okay, so here you can see that this figure suggests that obviously during a lockdown, there's definitely an impact on the agent's behavior. You see an increase in the posting behavior, but this effect seems to be a short-term effect because after the lockdown is lifted, we see that the posting probability started to decrease and eventually goes back to almost exactly the original pre-lockdown level. Well, although the effect is not permanent, we find that the short-term effect is actually not that short. It still takes about like 200 days for the agents to completely just go back to their original level. So this not so short effects of forced experimentation may still have some important policy effects. Okay, let me show you our last counterfactual for this talk. So here, like on top of the previous figure, what we did is that we actually trying to increase the reward the agent can receive during a lockdown period. So we like from a researcher's point of view, we just automatically increase the reward by 50% during the lockdown period. So you can see that this curves, the original red and the blue curves, just change to this purple and the green ones. Okay, so here one very interesting observation from these figures is that we observe quite heterogeneous effects of like this increased reward on people's behavior for late versus early adopters. The impact for this, we see a big boost in terms of the posting probability for the early adopters, but then there is a minimal impact essentially on the late adopters. Okay, so let me just quickly summarize what we find from this paper, from this exercise. So essentially what we see is that the marginal users the platform can gain via the forced experimentation are inherently different group of people. And those people are generally less loyal to the platform. And this this finding has implications for other forced experimentation schemes, such as those temporary membership or discounts offered by like the platforms like Groupon. And indeed, there are some like empirical evidence has already suggested that this type of scheme is not very effective in terms of building up the habits for the consumers. Our counterfactual experiments suggest that the effect of forced experimentation is likely to be temporal, but there still might be some policy implication of that. And from the platform's perspective, if you want to actually target people, then targeting on those intrinsically motivated consumers could be essentially more effective. Well, after all, you can lead a horse to water, but you can actually make them drink. Yeah, so the slides, we have a couple of, there are a lot of things we plan to do for this paper. The slides just give you a couple of our ideas. For example, we can do more counterfactuals, and we will also have lots of information about the actual tests. So maybe we can do textual and sentiment analysis. And we're also exploring other data sources in terms of people's gym attendance behavior and their home exercises behavior. Yeah, so this is everything I want to talk about, and I'm happy to hear any suggestions or feedback. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, E. Our discussant is Monica Capra, and we're going to be cut off at noon. So I hope to see you all in person next year. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So there are a lot of things that I like about this presentation. The paper is actually not finished yet, but to begin with, there is a unique data set with 20,000 users of a platform, Weibo, and they were able to identify those who used the platform before the lockdown, and then those who were kind of forced into the platform during the lockdown. And this is great because you can look at whether being forced into something and being kind of having the repetition that you didn't choose to do, whether that's going to generate a habit. And so this is can have it's an important topic, can have some consequences to other things like eating, buying, socializing, and exercise. For example, my own exercise routine has been affected by the lockdown. And the question is, do I go back to the normal, or is there a new normal? This forced experimentation is making us actually keep certain habits that we had not chosen to, certain actions that we had not chosen to do before. The other thing that is nice is that they come up with a structural model that is based on neuroscience, and there's this kind of dual model where actually there's evidence from neuroscience that the habitual processing is completely independent from the kind of goal-oriented processing. So you can use this neuroscience-based model to identify channels of behavior, such as whether it's through preference or habits. And once you have the structural model and identify the parameters and the values, you could do counterfactuals. As Ayi mentioned, you know, you can. What if we make the reward of using the social platform higher? How will that affect those early adopters compared to the later adopters? So that's what I liked. So what would I like to see in a paper? So I would like to have a more intuitive interpretation of the reliability variable. That's the variable that switches you from habit to goal-directed mode. And so I don't know how it is related to cue conditioning, because this dual processing, actually the identification of different areas of the brain, of the habitual versus the goal-directed, has been the scientists have been able to identify those through this cue conditioning. So I didn't quite understand what the intuition behind the reliability variable was, but it's a really important variable. The other thing that I would like to see is detailed explanation of the estimation and data. What data were used to measure reward and reliability, and why? For example, likes, repost, comments, a combination of all, a subset of one of them. And how do you measure change in frequency of the posts? For example, what is T? Like when you have these platforms, you have so much data, like milliseconds. And what is T? Is it T a second, a day, a week, you know, like a minute, and so on and so forth. The other thing is that it seems that to me that you could study more the early adopters, because the early adopters are those that they like likes as compared to the late adopters who don't seem to like likes. But the question of early adopters is like, look at this. So during the lockdown, they get a lot more likes because these late adopters are entering the platform. And if you just look at the trend, the slope, it should have been going down up, but then after the lockdown, it goes down. It's kind of strange what's happening with the early adopters. And also the late adopters, you could have these different groups of people, some which actually become very habitual and the forced experimentation has a long-term effect, and those who don't. So you could look at the observable characteristics of those who are early adopters and match to those that are late adopters and compare them. So compare to a subset of the late adopters. I think that would be very interesting. Other things that in search for habituation. So what will you do? Maybe longer exposure is needed. When you look at the 10,000 simulated, you allow them to be forced to in a lockdown for 200 days. However, in your data, you only have 75 days. What impact does it have? What if they stay longer? The other thing is in addiction literature, near misses trigger reward. So like, for example, you could compare whether, likes versus views, and the mismatch between the likes and views may actually get people to be more habituated. And also the emotionality of the posts. I don't know if Weibo users are polite, but what gets us riled up, perhaps makes us use something more because we are just into an emotional kind of trip. Cue conditioning is important for habit formation. So why do we brush our teeth every day? We see the toothbrush, we have our routine, and that generates reward, fresh mouth. Okay, so I wonder if you could identify through your data cues. One, for example, will be the time in which the first post is submitted, and whether identify those people who post at the same time, and also identify those people who get the reward right away. And that would be more consistent with the cue conditioning for habit.